While the lucky among us may have been able to experience at least parts or slivers of the pandemic as an unexpected retreat of sorts, I also know that I'm probably not only speaking for myself when I say that I have personally found it exceptionally difficult these days to focus, to pay attention. And the attention is a loaded term when it comes to Simone Weil. But to first speak of the opposite of attention, I thought to mention the way Eliot expresses this condition. In 4 quartets, he describes this situation as one of apathy without concentration, and the famous lines, distracted from distraction by distraction. But the philosopher Simone Weil devoted herself to the very opposite of this condition. She called it attention, often experienced as an ephemeral moment of shining clarity, of saving grace, something that touches the Platonic trifecta, good, true, and beautiful. For her, moments like these, including the moment of her own conversion, came to her as she read a poem. This is what we'll be discussing today. I want to gesture to you all her birth date and her death date. She was born in 1909 and she died in 1943. Her life was short and bookended by 2 world wars. Her life was also marked by asceticism from the very beginning to the very end. As a small child, she refused to take sugar out of concern for soldiers on the French front whom she had heard were suffering from depleted rations. And of course, she's ignominious for her death when she refused to take nourishment and as a result died of aggravated tuberculosis. This image of her, which I'd like to funnel your attention toward, is taken from an early edition of Waiting for God. From it, we can notice her lucid, clear-eyed expression, her gaze, clear, alert, benevolent, stays with me, and I think it reflects one of the most remarkable aspects of her personality. That's her unremitting honesty, her standard for the truth, her intolerance for bad faith. Her gaze seems to cut right through all of the dross. So the backdrop of this image is that of curlicued handwriting, if you look closely. This is her own handwriting. And in fact, most of the writing we treasure by her today was culled from her voluminous collection of notebooks, which she entrusted to a friend shortly before her death. Without going into her philosophy in too fine detail, I want to gesture to a few of her most well-known works and concepts. So the first, Waiting for God, of which 2 excerpts have been provided to you as suggested reading. We have The Need for Roots, Gravity and Grace, and Oppression and Liberty. I hope these titles give you all a sense of the breadth of her thought, because it's very important to note that as much as Weil was a philosopher and scholar of comparative religion, she was also just as comfortable and just as urgent in social political commentary. Many of you will know that she worked for the French resistance from London, where she, being from a Jewish family, had fled her native France. She also volunteered to fight in the Spanish Civil War. She also spent a part of her life doing heavy labor. She worked in car factories and in the fields picking grapes. To go on to her ideas, she's perhaps most famous for her notion of attention, which inspired much of Iris Murdoch's thinking. For her, attention was the rarest and purest form of generosity. Another term we can ascribe to Weil is that of decreation. This is a theological concept that has to do with the idea that what Christians know as the creation of the world is not just God speaking everything into existence, just like that, making something out of nothing, but also to imagine that this creation took something from God as well. It's the idea that in order for something to exist, a being that was everything consented to be a little bit less. And in that space, in that cave, that's where we exist. It's in the shadow of God, the space, the cavity that's left behind. So for Weil, decreation is how we return the favor. It's the renunciation of our own selves by our own consent in order to make room for God again. It's a mirror act of love. And what we'll be discussing today, the core idea, is the possibility that the state of true attention that she describes is simultaneously a state of decreation, of consenting not to exist, of disappearing for a moment. After Weil graduated first in her class at the École Normale in Paris, she was for a short time a school teacher. In her reflections on the right use of school studies, she lays out her conception of attention, describing it as a negative effort, one that consists more so in patient waiting than in muscular will. In a section I find humorous, she talks about how pupils told to pay attention often furrow their brows, clench their fists, sweat falls down their faces, but she thinks that's really the wrong idea. To read the quote on the page, attention consists of suspending our thought, leaving it detached, empty, and ready to be penetrated by the object. She also wrote in this text that the ideal student has to work without any wish to gain good marks, any wish to win school successes, do well on tests, in order to gain this precious pearl, which is a habit of attention that has the substance of prayer. Perhaps unsurprisingly, her pupils failed the state exam that year. This prompted Weil's dismissal from the school, but she actually wore this as a badge of honor. Already in this text, she makes the connection between attention and an inherently religious attitude, that of prayer, which brings us to the next slide, George Herbert's poem, Love 3, which I always think of as her conversion poem. So to tell you the story, it's the year 1938, and Weil has spent 10 days at a very beautiful monastery in France called Salem. There, she meets a young Anglican who urged her to read the English metaphysical poets. Weil was extremely touched by this poem, and she committed it to heart, to memory. What you see on the right side of this panel is her own transcription by hand of this famous poem. We'll take a look at it in just a minute, but I first want to tell you guys what this poem, what effect it had on her. She writes in a letter to her friend, "I used to think I was merely reciting it as a beautiful poem, but without my knowing it, the recitation had the virtue of a prayer. It was during one of these recitations that, as I told you, Christ himself came down and took possession of me." To move to the poem, for those of you who aren't familiar with it, it starts with these very famous lines, "Love bade me welcome, yet my soul drew back, guilty of dust and sin. But quick-eyed love, observing me grow slack from my first entrance in, drew nearer to me, sweetly questioning if I lacked anything." In the poem, there are two figures, a kind of Christ figure called Love, and the narrator. The narrator is very ashamed and trying to find every opportunity to leave. She feels undeserving, all too cognizant of her sin and maybe even her inattention. But Love here is insistent, welcoming, sweet, and serving. It's particularly poignant to me to understand how much this meant for Weil because of what I know of her life story and the attitude she tended to take. There were great friendships in her life, and indeed she was very close to her brother, the famous mathematician Andre. But overall, we can sort of tell by the crowded biography and the short lifespan that there was surely much isolation, much self-imposed suffering. And if you read her notebooks, they're full of especially harsh words for herself. So when I read this narrator, looking for every opportunity to get out, kind of expecting punishment, expecting not to be seen, and instead Love does the opposite. It's very beautiful. For those of you who read the spiritual autobiography, which was a letter that she sent to a French priest while she was deliberating on whether or not to officially convert to the Catholic Church, one thing that stands out is that Weil hardly uses possessive pronouns to refer to herself. She also favors the passive voice when she describes what's happening to her. To me, this illustrates the complete detachment that this experience achieved in her. She speaks not of possessing, but of being possessed, of being grasped, and by this grasp, annihilated by a supernatural reality, dimensionally larger than oneself. To point you toward the second half of this slide, she talks about how in her youthful adolescence, her hyper-rational, hyper-uncompromising attitude as a young person caused her to never foresee the possibility of real contact, person to person, here below, between a human being and God. And then this happened to her. I think it's kind of funny that she thought she was just reading a poem, and then something akin to a bolt of lightning out of space just struck her. But of course, hers is not the only literary conversion in history. One of the most famous theologians, St. Augustine, he was sitting in a garden when he heard a voice say, "Take up and read." And then the book fell open to a page, and the rest is history. To talk a little bit more about the way we can try and think of poetry as being a decreative activity, we'll move to the next page, because for Weil, her conversion is one of 4 aesthetic encounters or experiences. There is the chanting of the monks that took her outside of her body as she experienced one of her severe chronic headaches. There was also the experience of the procession of a small Portuguese fishing village and the songs and hymns that they sang to their patron saint. There's the George Herbert poem. And finally, it's succeeded by one of the most familiar prayers of the Christian religion, the Our Father, or the Lord's Prayer. For her and for us, although it's easy to forget this, the poem was able to achieve in her an experience of humility. I know that that's the experience I tend to have when reading poetry. Sometimes nothing happens at all. But let's think a little bit phenomenologically about the reading of poetry and how it can give the reader practice in self-extinction. What I argue is that poems effect a partial kenosis or self-emptying in their readers because they channel our attention toward the words of a poem instead of other phenomena that might otherwise fill our mental space. Our eyes follow the descending lines of a poem. Usually, unless we're Bob Dylan, we aren't given license to spontaneously insert new lines in a poem. So there's a fundamental sense of just giving up your creative potential and following along a poem, interacting with it on its own terms. And should we be tempted to rebel, we might consider Weil's words on the correct attitude to have toward what is beautiful. She writes that the beautiful is that which we cannot wish to change, because if we wanted to change it or to possess it, we would be soiling it. So while the poem, like a well-used path, may be new to a reader upon first encounter, the reader does not create the poem. Instead, she is decreated by it. She does not cause the poem to come into existence, but conversely, the poem may cause her to cease to exist for a moment. So looking at the Greek words, she would recite this prayer in Greek as she harvested grapes. And it kind of prompts me to ask why we can't, I mean, not to speak for everyone in this Zoom chat, but why can't this experience of being almost exploded by a poem or by a prayer, why does it not happen to us more often? And I think, at least with the Our Father, for even those among us who do not have any religion or for whom we practice another religion, it's so overly familiar that it's hard to be touched by it. But Something about Vei's story prompts me to wish for myself and for everyone that we wouldn't become jaded to these words, and to return back to Vei's own spiritual autobiography. Vei wrote that these familiar words had the effect of tearing her from her body and transporting it to a place outside of space, where she felt the real presence of Christ. In other words, these words function for her as a sacrament would, if we're talking from a theological point of view. And I think that's significant in part because Vei died refusing the sacrament of baptism. To this day, her conversion remains contested, a little confused, a little controversial, but I think her life has become a testimony for all the people who are supposed to hear it.